Russia has waged war against Ukraine for over 36 months, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Repke with BILD Situation Room, and we start with terrible images from the central Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. There, the Russian army used an Iskander medium-range missile yesterday evening to destroy a hotel in the heart of the city. Here's footage from the rescue teams on site. As mentioned, truly grim images. There were 3 fatalities, 31 injured. According to current information, the civilians were hit by a precisely targeted medium-range missile. The Iskander missile has a range of about 450 kilometers and weighs about 500 kilograms. And we're now seeing the hotel after the impact. And of course, it's not the first time that Kryvyi Rih has been hit. A central Ukrainian city that, of course, is also crucial for the logistics of the Ukrainian army towards the east and south. Nonetheless, once again, civilians have been hit, or at least civilian infrastructure has been targeted in this attack. And all of this comes just a few hours after Donald Trump made it clear, and this was confirmed, that there would no longer be any intelligence information shared, meaning no more information about the launch of ballistic missiles and nor any more weapons for Ukraine. We'll take a look at a before and after image at the end, which will once again show the destruction here. So here's the Hotel Zentral, perfectly situated right in the heart of Kryvyi Rih, and down below you can see a restaurant that's been set up there. And these are the recordings from the Ukrainian civil defense following the attack. As mentioned, a total of 34 dead and injured in this latest Russian assault on Ukrainian civilians, marking another tragic escalation. And from Kryvyi Rih in central Ukraine, we move to the eastern part of the country, to the region Donetsk. Here we have new footage of the battles around Pokrovsk, showing us that the Ukrainian army is continuing to advance, that they are still pushing back the Russians, and we have, as I said, very recent footage from Udakne showing us that in a completely destroyed industrial complex which had been taken by the Russian soldiers are now surrendering. So we witnessed the total devastation surrounding this factory here, situated along a railway line. We now see the Russian soldiers emerging from the rubble. They've already decided to surrender, wanting to give themselves up to the Ukrainians, refusing to stay and fight any longer on the front lines here. For whatever reason, either because they were injured or wounded, or because, as we've shown repeatedly in recent weeks, the supply lines to other Russian troops were cut off. Here we now see very striking footage. The Ukrainian helps them, holding this pole down, and we see the Russians attempting to climb up along this pole toward the railway embankment in order to then be captured. Very interesting, the last Russian here can hardly stand at all. He's just crawling forward. That means the Russian soldiers here are also in an extremely poor condition. But unlike when Ukrainians surrender to Russians, who are then sometimes shot en masse, the Ukrainians here are completely different, humanely inclined, actually helping the Russians. The whole thing is initially carried out by a soldier. However, we can assume, as we'll see shortly on the left side, that other soldiers are securing the area. That means there are likely Ukrainians here who, of course, with their weapons, keeping an eye on the situation during the capture, making sure there's no trap, that none of the Russians trigger a grenade or something similar. Nevertheless, the whole situation shows us how the Russian soldiers surrender and how they are now, here comes the second Ukrainian from the left side, how they are then led away across the tracks toward Udakne, a bit further northwest, into a section of the city that remains firmly under Ukrainian control, where they'll be processed. We want to take a look at this on the map right away while we see the Russian soldiers being taken away. Udakne, the 5th location where the Ukrainian forces have successfully managed to gain at least partial control in the area surrounding Pokrovsk. We have now also acknowledged the new advances by Ukraine near Uspennivka, which we mentioned yesterday. So, just to quickly recap, both at Lysivka, Peshane, Kotline, Uspennivka, and what we just saw at Udakne, namely this area here, we just watched the video from there. Everywhere the Russians aren't advancing but are slowly being pushed back by Ukraine's forces, and that's the key. While Donald Trump and while the USA are cutting off their aid, essentially doing everything to allow the Russians to advance again and to undermine these small Ukrainian successes that we've seen here around Pokrovsk, of course, the most crucial city for the Russians right now, formerly 65,000 inhabitants, and it's not even that close to Kramatorsk or Sloviansk, the other cities in the east. They're attempting to seize Pokrovsk here. The Ukrainians, as mentioned, are managing quite successfully to defend the city. And now, at 5 points, they were able to push the Russians back around the city. The soldiers we just saw are not the only ones surrendering to the Ukrainian army. We're seeing that in some media, particularly Russian propaganda, it's constantly claimed the Ukrainian army is on the brink. We have the situation where many Russian soldiers are either surrendering to the Ukrainians or even taking their own lives. Such videos exist as well, which we show very rarely. Here we have another scene where a Russian soldier has surrendered, likely signaled, either to a drone or by radio, he no longer wants to fight. Here we see Ukrainians arriving in a small civilian car, once again clearly showing how poorly equipped Ukraine was by us as well. And now this Russian is being arrested here. Once again, we are witnessing a completely standard and entirely routine procedure in place for the capture of an opposing combatant. One's holding him firmly at gunpoint, keeping a close watch with his rifle to ensure no trouble arises, and the other one immediately ties him up with restraints, then he's escorted away, and they promptly begin heading back in their initial direction. To get back behind their own lines, of course, the whole thing, as mentioned, an unarmored vehicle, a civilian vehicle. So an extremely dangerous situation for the Ukrainians as well, who are exposing themselves to Russian kamikaze drones here to capture a Russian soldier. Nevertheless, we see it in various sectors of the front, the Russians currently being in such a poor condition along the front that they surrender to the Ukrainians. We now look at the western Russian region of Kursk, where the situation is quite different. There, we observe an overwhelming dominance of the Russian army, relentlessly pushing forward from the east, west, and north into this remaining contested part of Kursk. And we have new footage here showing us how the Russian army is causing significant destruction and devastation among Ukrainian troops with their fiber optic guided kamikaze drones. Here we have a Ukrainian T-64BV tank in Kursk, which appears to have already been immobilized and is now being attacked by 2 fiber optic drones from the Russian army. And we can once again see, first of all, based on the delta here, that we are in Kursk, which the Russians are also confirming, of course. We can once again see that the drone is acting very precisely, that it's possible, thanks to the fiber optic control here, to be extremely accurate. Indeed, to target a specific hatch, namely the driver's hatch, which is located here in the front center. There is the armor, positioned just behind this additional layer here, so the armor there is extremely thin. The drone is about to fly right in and manages to strike precisely between the turret and the hull in this exact spot. We'll see it right away in the second drone approach. This is now the second drone attempting the same approach, aiming for the same spot again, to strike the same location. We can see the tank is already on fire, not just externally, and as it approaches, flames are visibly bursting out from the driver's hatch. This means the first drone has already caused significant damage inland, and the second one was now, so to speak, added to ensure that the Ukrainians can no longer recover the tank. Now we see it on the closer approach. Here, the first flames, but what I wanted to say is here in the middle. I think it's quite visible now, so here you can see that's the driver's hatch and the flames are shooting out of it, which likely indicates another tank, probably from the Ukrainian army. That's being lost. All of this is resulting in the Russians being able to advance further in Kursk. They maintain air superiority and hold the advantage with kamikaze drones. They are also deploying, as mentioned, many thousands of soldiers. In Pokrovsk, it's different, as we've just seen. We saw it. Those were just 5 Russians who were supposed to hold a position in Udakne, at least the Russian-controlled part of the town. In Kursk, the situation is entirely different. The Ukrainian army is in a very challenging position, vulnerable to attacks from 3 directions. And here we're seeing this vital supply route that stretches all the way towards Sucha. And the Russians seem to be trying once more to avoid this final battle for Sucha. Sucha, a once 6,500-strong town, is where Ukrainians have entrenched. And we can clearly observe that the Russians are attempting, both from Pleshovo and from Svetlikovo, to advance towards this. They are attempting to reach the last or only supply route, because if they were to succeed, as always, the Ukrainians would have to withdraw on a large scale, since naturally you can't maintain an encircled defense. You can't simply accept being encircled, so to speak, and defend from there. In the past few days, we've also mentioned where the Russians are advancing further. Moving toward Malaya Lokhnya, we can clearly observe the dark blue area steadily shrinking. We observed Sverdlikovo captured about a week ago, and now this entire area, which was once blue or at least light blue, we can clearly see, is firmly under Russian control. The situation is so dire for the Ukrainians that the front, here, there, and there, is being pushed further into Ukraine, towards the Sumy region. So, in a way, the Russians are trying to turn the tables, saying after you attacked Kursk from Sumy, now we're going to attack Sumy from Kursk, to ensure that these territories can no longer be sustained through Ukrainian logistical operations. From the Russian front, we once again return to Ukrainian Donetsk, to the Donetsk region. There we have new footage from Toretsk, a city that once again shows us why the Russians were so eager to push through here quickly, why they wanted to advance further west after capturing this city. We have repeatedly explained in recent days that this did not work. On the contrary, we'll see it on the map. Ukrainians are back in the city center. Indeed, the Russians still maintain a number of main battle tanks, such as this T-80 right here. but of course they are stored somewhere in the city. And the moment a tank is stored and over weeks, essentially the whole thing is observed by Ukrainian surveillance drones. We frequently observe these tanks being located, and then kamikaze drones are sent one after another in 3 cases. This was the first. Here is the second, and immediately we also see the third, where in 3 consecutive instances we have the situation that stationed tanks or other heavy vehicles are being attacked within the city, which actually, here's the next tank being attacked, intended to be housed initially before rolling further westward. We see further attacks on the logistics of the Russians, and here we once again see the problem. Clearly not just a Russian issue, we just saw that the Ukrainians had to drive a civilian vehicle straight to the front line. That was probably a Western off-road vehicle. Here we see once more a white Lada of the Russian army, being utilized for logistics within Toretsk, but all of this clearly demonstrates to us it's by no means just a Ukrainian problem that there is a lack of vehicles or that there aren't enough armored vehicles, but it's an issue that currently affects both armies. In a situation where both are heavily battered, but Ukraine is slowly fighting its way back, in this very situation, the US halts its aid, thereby turning the tide once again in favor of Russia. Let's take a closer look at the situation in Toretsk again. See where the Russians had already advanced, where they had captured a large part of the city, and where they aimed to push further westward. Let's now attempt to outline the city area of Toretsk itself here, which was roughly the extent of it. The Russians' goal was to advance far to the west. That's why the tanks had already been positioned in the city. However, the Ukrainians have come back. We can see here, up to the city center, attempts are being made at various locations to fight their way forward again. And accordingly, the battle for Toretsk continues, and the Russians have not been able to claim victory in it so far. It highlights just how dire the situation is for the Russian army. For the first time, the Ukrainians have managed to reclaim lost territory and, at least in part, successfully pushed the Russians back. So, now we want to look at 2 very sensational recordings. One, the first ever recordings from the cockpit of an F-16 of the Ukrainian Air Force. Here we have new recordings intended to demonstrate, I'll let it play through, that we should certainly thank the USA despite the accusations from Trump and J.D. Vance that we're not grateful enough. That, of course, is complete nonsense. Not only does Zelensky himself repeatedly thank the US for its support, but we also see here that the pilots of the Ukrainian pilots thank for the F-16s, though they're not from the US. That has to be clearly emphasized. The current F-16s are coming from Denmark and the Netherlands. Nevertheless, a significant portion of the spare parts and also the weapons have been supplied by the United States. In this regard, of course, all Ukrainian soldiers are deeply and immensely grateful to the USA, particularly Biden's administration, for the support they have provided. Under Trump, it probably looks a bit different, but what's also interesting is that we see like the armament of this aircraft, that also gives us clear indications about its operational use. Here we can clearly observe that so-called Sidewinder missiles are securely attached to both wings. These are short-range air-to-air missiles up to 5 kilometers for engaging hostile targets. Actually, these missiles, and of course these F-16s, are designed for aerial combat. That means an American plane, for example, engages in combat with a Vietnamese or Russian plane or whatever. However, currently there are no Russian aircraft over Ukrainian airspace. Instead, there are even more Russian cruise missiles and Russian kamikaze drones, specifically the long-range ones about 4 meters long. And these missiles or these aircraft are intercepted by the F-16s. That, as far as it is currently known, remains the primary purpose of the existing F-16 fleet. You don't necessarily engage the front as much, you don't strike ground targets or even Russian aircraft over Russia as frequently, but it's more about, well, the broader strategy. Cruise missiles and chasing after the kamikaze drones, you're about 3 times as fast as them, and then from a relatively short distance, maximum 5 kilometers, directly engage them with its Sidewinder missiles, and we see it alone. This F-16 could theoretically, if used correctly, which is also the question, especially since the Americans are no longer sharing their intelligence insights, where the kamikaze drones are approaching, for example, or their flight paths in Ukraine, but theoretically, this F-16 could appear in this scenario here. With its missiles intercept 4 Russian kamikaze drones before they have a chance to reach and damage critical infrastructure, such as power plants in Ukraine. Finally, we want to take a look at a relatively modern Ukrainian drone with the interesting name Werewolf. And this drone is specifically designed to intercept and ram Russian surveillance drones, effectively bringing them down from the sky over Ukraine. This is a truly unique drone, swiftly and rapidly ascending into the sky. We're trying to capture that quickly. As you can see, it needs just a moment to get started. From 0 meters to 1,000 meters altitude, so to 1 kilometer altitude, it takes 23 seconds. That means this drone ascends over 40 meters per second, gaining altitude at an incredibly rapid pace. with a service ceiling specified by the manufacturer reaching up to 5 kilometers, higher than the Russian drones can fly, and also reaching speeds of up to 200 kilometers per hour. And for comparison, the Russian Zala Lancet drones, for example, meaning the large kamikaze drones with a range of about 70 kilometers, have a speed of 110 kilometers per hour. That means these small drones here, which are deployed to take down the larger Russian drones, are nearly twice as fast in comparison. And now we're seeing the footage from this very small, highly agile drone. And this is an entirely new product because it's not used to attack ground targets, but rather to engage air targets. And we'll see in a moment, towards the end, how here a Sala Supercam is also being targeted. That's a surveillance drone belonging to the Russian army. Next up, we have a Lancet drone. As mentioned, that's the kamikaze drone with a 70-kilometer range. And finally, a Sala 421, also of the Russian army. This means we see these small aircraft here with their absolutely superior flight characteristics, which we just discussed, are perfectly capable of taking down a significant portion of the short or medium-range drones currently operated by the Russian army. Very important, this of course doesn't apply to the Garand 2 we just mentioned, to these large long-range drones. For that, you'd need F-16 fighter jets or ground-based air defense systems in place. Nevertheless, for the very first time, we're getting a detailed look at how this Werewolf drone is designed and how Ukraine has managed over recent months to take down more than 2,000 mid-range drones used by the Russian army for surveillance and short-range kamikaze operations.